Now to what legal analysts say was a significant development in the case against former President Donald Trump. Trump is not immune from civil lawsuits looking to blame him for the January 6th insurrection. This is a big step against him. In a unanimous ruling on Friday, a 3-judge appellate court found the former president is not entitled to immunity as an elected official because he was speaking as a candidate on January 6th, not in his official capacity as then president. Multiple police officers and members of Congress sued Trump nearly 2 years ago, saying he incited the riot at the Capitol. The ruling does not say Trump is liable in those suits. It only says the cases may now move forward to find out if he is liable. In a separate court on Friday, Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is overseeing Trump's federal election interference trial, ruled the former president also does not have protection from criminal prosecution. In her decision, Judge Chutkan wrote, quote, "Whatever immunities a sitting president may enjoy, the United States has only one chief executive at a time, and that position does not confer a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free pass." And yet, Donald Trump is now trying to claim it is Joe Biden who is the threat to democracy.
Joe Biden is not the defender of American democracy. Joe Biden is the destroyer of American democracy, and it's him and his people. They can do whatever they want, break any law, tell any lie, ruin any life, trash any norm, and get away with anything they want.
What projection? What confession on his part?
The New York Times writes, quote, "Mr. Trump has a history of accusing his opponents of behavior that he himself is guilty of, the political equivalent of a no you are playground retort. Polls have shown that significant percentages of voters in both parties are concerned about threats to democracy. During the midterm elections, candidates who embraced Mr. Trump's lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him were defeated, even in races in which voters did not rank democracy as a top concern. Mr. Trump and his campaign have sought to dismiss such concerns as a concoction to scare voters. But on Saturday, they tried to turn the Biden campaign's arguments back against the president."
Let's bring in right now the host of The Last Word on MSNBC, Lawrence O'Donnell, also Justice Department reporter for the New York Times, Katie Benner. Thank you all. Thank you for being with us. Lawrence, it's a little harder for Donald Trump to say, no, you are, when it's Donald Trump who said he would terminate the Constitution if he needed to do that to become president again, who is talking about executing members of the military, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because he's not insufficiently loyal, taking networks off the air and trying their leaders for treason because they are insufficiently loyal to him. And yes, was the guy that incited the riots on January the 6th. So talk about Donald Trump and the rising threat that he poses to democracy, regardless of what he tries to project onto Joe Biden.
Well, this is what he believes works for him, is to actually just tell these lies so directly. And it almost seems that the more his lies about Joe Biden mirror what Donald Trump has actually done, the happier he is when he's actually just delivering it right back with absolutely no substance to it whatsoever. I did a long piece the other night, Joe, about how the leading Republican presidential candidate came out and said, I want to close down a news network. And there was nothing. There was nothing. The 3 national news broadcasts, NBC, ABC, CBS, did not mention it, didn't mention it. Now, here's the thought experiment. Imagine Joe Biden came out, and the language he used was, you should use the power of government to come down hard on MSNBC. That's what he said. So let's say President Biden comes out today and says, I am announcing that I am using the power of government to come down hard on Fox. How long would it be that was the leading story in the country before any other story ever got air? And that's the world we're living in.
Yep.
Well, it's a world we're
Well
living
put.
in. It's also the world we're living in where Hillary Clinton can talk about contemptible deplorables. Can talk about deplorables. It's on the front page of the newspapers for days. It's discussed for the rest of the campaign. Donald Trump uses Nazi terminology to dehumanize his opponents, vermin, and it's barely a blip. But, you know, Katie, talk about the threats in the future to the Justice Department with a look back at what Donald Trump said at the end of his campaign. I'm always surprised this didn't get more attention, where Donald Trump said 2 weeks before the campaign ended in 2020 that the Justice Department, his attorney general, should arrest Joe Biden and his family and send them to jail.
Yes, certainly. So I think it's not just what Donald Trump said at the end of his presidency, but what he continues to say on the campaign trail. He's made very clear that his top priority, if he becomes president again, is vengeance, and that he understands that as the chief law enforcement officer, he would love to use the Justice Department and the FBI in order to exact that vengeance. So it's not just that he wants whoever his attorney general is to investigate a political opponent. He has somewhat of a list that we know, according to reporting. You know, there are people who worked in his own administration who have since criticized him. So people like former Attorney General Bill Barr, people like Ty Cobb, his former lawyer when he was under investigation, the Mueller investigation. These people have criticized him, and now they believe, and he has said that he would like to go after enemies like that, using the Justice Department, basically explicitly saying that the rule of law is no longer something that under the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law, but that the rule of law will be wielded specifically politically, and that's the threat that he poses there.
Lawrence, you were talking about how Trump can say the most outrageous illiberal things, such as banning a major network, and it will barely be a blip in the radar. And
Zero, not even a blip.
Yeah.
It didn't get a blip. It didn't get mentioned in the national news media that undecided voters ever see.
And it's almost as Trump, some of the things he said in 2016 that were so outrageous, beating up people at his rallies, and he supported it, political violence. Now he's just on a different level. How does the media have to adjust and recalibrate to not cover this as a campaign, but to cover it as a man who is under indictment, 91 counts?
Yeah, this has been the question, I think, actually, since 2011, when Donald Trump first started lying about President Obama's birth certificate. And I called that a lie immediately, called him a liar immediately. He was shocked. He didn't know that he could be called a liar for that. It took the New York Times 5 years after that to first call Donald Trump a liar, use the word lie, about the birth certificate. So that shows you the built-in lag time of reaction in most of the media for this kind of new phenomenon. You know, the thing about the Trump administration and how they would use the Justice Department, as Katie was just talking about, to go after the enemies. This is why I think the prosecution in Georgia by Fani Willis might be the most important of all, because there you see Trump lawyers facing the possibility now, live possibility, of going to prison. You see Trump lawyers indicted. You see Giuliani has been temporarily disbarred. He's going to be disbarred. All these lawyers, most of them are going to end up disbarred, some of them in prison. That's the lesson. That's the lesson. The Jeffrey Clark, the former Justice Department official who tried to do the most to help Donald Trump, the most illegally, is now facing prison, and he will be disbarred. The Jeffrey Clark picture should be on the wall in any Justice Department, controlled by Donald Trump, to remind them all that Donald Trump's not going to live forever, and at some point there's going to be other people in charge of this Justice Department, and every one of you will be prosecuted like Jeffrey Clark is being prosecuted in Georgia now, if you do the things that Donald Trump is saying he wants you to do.